The story begins with 4 rugby players who had gone out to sea to fish. When it was time to return, their anchor, about 50 meters away, became badly stuck on the seabed. They did not want to leave the expensive anchor behind, so the captain told everyone to pull together. All 4 professional athletes put their full strength into the rope. They pulled so hard that the entire boat began to tilt to one side, but the cursed anchor would not move. Finally, the captain decided to use the engine to pull the anchor. That single mistake turned an ordinary fishing trip into a brutal survival ordeal. Welcome to another action-packed video from Flick Movies. On Saturday morning, February 28, 2009, at 5 a.m., the 4 rugby players arrived at the marina. Their plan was to enjoy a relaxed weekend fishing trip. The 4 men were Nick Schuyler, Will Blakely, Corey Smith, and Marquis Cooper. Their friendship had started through rugby, and by then they were like brothers. They had no idea that this ordinary-looking weekend would change their lives forever. Will was going out to sea for the first time, so he was very excited. He asked whether the ocean would be very rough. Marcus said it might be a little rough because he wanted to reach the fishing spot before the storm arrived. The word storm immediately made Will alert. He asked about the weather. Marcus honestly told him that a major storm was coming, but he had calculated the timing. They would finish fishing by around 2 p.m. and return before evening. The bad weather was expected later at night. Will felt somewhat reassured, although the fear inside him did not completely disappear. Corey took out a waterproof bag and told everyone to put their phones inside. He explained that sea salt could damage the phones and that they would lose signal after going a few miles offshore anyway. Will agreed, but he still asked whether the boat had a radio. Marcus joked that they had 2 straws and a long rope. Everyone laughed. Then he seriously confirmed that there was a radio. Will sheepishly admitted that he might be being overly cautious, but the uneasiness inside him remained. At 6:30 a.m., the boat was heading toward the deep ocean. Everything looked beautiful. At the same time, on land, television weather reports were warning about strong cold winds and a major storm. Meteorologists were describing severe upper atmospheric disturbance. Nick's mother saw the weather report and immediately called him. The phone rang for a while and then went to voicemail because it was locked inside the waterproof bag. She left a message saying that she had seen the weather report and wanted to make sure Nick knew about the storm. There was clear concern in her voice, but the message would never be heard. Hip-hop music was playing on the boat. They reached their first fishing spot and dropped their lines. Nick got lucky and quickly caught a large fish. He happily showed it to everyone. Marcus had named the spot Cooper's Hole and said that the place never disappointed. Nick joked that the name sounded strange. Meanwhile, Will noticed the shining ring on Corey's finger. It was the 2002 Super Bowl championship ring Corey had won with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. It was the biggest achievement of his career. But the glory did not last long. A little later, Marcus decided to move into deeper water. The boat sped forward again. Nick's face soon began to turn pale. The movement of the waves made his stomach churn, and he became seasick. He leaned over the side of the boat and tried to breathe deeply, but it did not help. Will told him to lie down because he looked very ill. Nick weakly admitted that he should not have acted tough that morning. He had joked that seasickness medicine was for weak people. Now he understood his mistake, but it was too late. At around 9 a.m., they reached Marcus's favorite fishing spot. The engine was turned off and they prepared to drop the anchor. Marcus specifically instructed them to keep the rope tight and lower the anchor slowly. He had accidentally lost the anchor the previous time. By 1 p.m., the sky had begun to darken. The storm was approaching, so they immediately decided to head back. Corey began pulling up the anchor, but it was stuck. He used all his strength, yet the rope remained straight and tight. The anchor would not move. Marcus joined him. Then all 4 pulled together, but the anchor was firmly lodged among rocks on the seabed. The sky grew darker and thunder rolled. Marcus decided to use the engine. The engine started and the boat moved forward. The rope tightened even more. Marcus told everyone to hold on because the boat could move violently. He slowly increased the throttle. The engine roared, but the rope was pulling the boat backward and downward. The bow rose into the air while the stern sank into the water. The boat tilted at a dangerous angle. All 4 men clung to the railing, completely focused on the tight rope behind them. None of them noticed the danger rising in front of them. A gigantic wave was building. The sky was black, and the wave looked like a moving wall of water. By the time they noticed the strange change in light and heard the unusual roar, it was too late. The enormous wave slammed directly into the front of the boat. The boat flipped as if a giant had slapped it aside. Everything turned upside down. When they surfaced, they saw that the boat was completely overturned. Their only protection was now the empty hull of an upside-down boat. The 4 men shouted each other's names to make sure everyone was alive. Marcus told them to stay near the boat because it was still floating and could provide support. They tried to turn it upright, but they could not. Then Will remembered that the anchor rope was still attached and was pulling the boat down. They had no knife. Will dove underwater and used the sharp edge near the propeller to cut the rope. Even after the rope was cut, the situation did not improve much. The boat remained upside down. After about 30 minutes drifting in the ocean, Marcus came up with another plan. He suggested tying the rope they had just cut to one side of the boat and pulling together, hoping the rope would help them flip the boat. The plan sounded reasonable, so all 4 tried again. Meanwhile, the storm on land was getting stronger. Weather reports warned that it could reach the strength of a Category 2 hurricane. About 5 hours after the boat overturned, they realized that righting it was almost impossible. The boat was heavy, and their strength was rapidly disappearing in the cold water. Every attempt drained more energy, and in water this cold, energy was life. They finally had to accept that they could not turn the boat over. They needed another way to survive. Marcus calmed himself and thought about what useful supplies they could recover from the boat. He reminded everyone that there was a cooler containing food and water, probably secured with a rope. Will immediately asked where the life jackets were. Marcus said they were in a storage compartment on the left side of the cabin. Will offered to retrieve them, but Marcus pointed out a serious problem: opening the cabin would let water inside and could make the boat sink faster. It was a difficult choice: keep the boat floating as long as possible or risk it to retrieve the life jackets. After thinking about it, they realized that the boat would probably sink eventually, but they needed life jackets immediately. Without them, they would not survive the cold water through the night. Marcus decided to go himself. As captain, he was taking responsibility. The problem was that he was wearing heavy clothes that made it difficult to dive. He removed his shirt, even though that would make him colder. Taking a deep breath, he went underwater. This time he succeeded. In the dark water, he felt around until he found the cabin handle. Above him, the other 3 could feel the boat sinking slightly lower. After a few moments, it stopped. Marcus eventually surfaced with a life jacket in his hand. The others breathed a sigh of relief. Marcus went down again and brought up 2 more life jackets. After resting, he made a 3rd dive and returned with a flare gun. This was a real source of hope. A flare could provide a way to signal for help if a ship passed nearby. There were also about 15 bottles of water left inside the cabin. If they could retrieve them, they could survive longer. This time Corey said he would go. But as soon as he went underwater, he returned within seconds. He was panicked and said he could not see anything. The water was too cold, and he would not go back down. Then they heard a sound in the distance, a ship's horn. The 4 men suddenly became excited. They waved their arms and fired the flare. They shouted as loudly as they could, hoping the ship would see them. But the ship continued on its course. The horn slowly faded into the distance, and the vessel disappeared into the darkness and storm. Their brief hope turned into emptiness again. Suddenly Nick remembered his bag. His phone was inside it. If they could retrieve the bag, perhaps they could make a call. Hope returned. Nick said he needed to rest and warm his body before diving again. Meanwhile, Will tried to lighten the mood with a joke. He asked Corey whether things could possibly get worse, mentioning Detroit's 0-6 record from the previous year. Despite their exhaustion, they laughed a little. Corey said this might be the first time he wished he were back in Detroit. On land, Paula and Nick's mother were talking on the phone. They were worried because no one could reach the men. Eventually, they decided to call the police. At sea, Nick gathered his strength and dove for the bag. He managed to retrieve it. The three others were thrilled. They took out the phones and tried calling, but there was no signal. Nick shouted in frustration, asking whether 911 was supposed to work everywhere and whether there was some kind of satellite connection. The truth was that in the middle of the ocean, their phones were useless. Marcus told them to turn the phones off to save battery. Perhaps they would find a signal later. Meanwhile, the police had received a report. A pickup truck was found at the marina with an empty boat trailer behind it. Authorities suspected that the men were stranded at sea. The Coast Guard was notified and a search operation began. But the four men in the ocean had no idea that help was already on the way. Night fell. Marcus's condition began to worsen. His body was shaking violently and his teeth were chattering. He could barely speak and kept saying that he was very cold. Nick explained that feeling cold was still a good sign because it meant the body was still fighting. The real danger was when a person stopped feeling cold because that meant body temperature had fallen dangerously low and the brain could begin sending confused signals. To motivate themselves, they repeated the chant they used during training. It was no longer just words, it was their determination to survive. Then Corey noticed that the rain had stopped. Nick said perhaps God had heard them. At that moment, however, they heard a strange rumbling in the distance. It was not thunder. Something large seemed to be moving toward them. The sound grew louder. The surface of the ocean became increasingly disturbed, and the pattern of the waves changed as if a powerful force were pushing through the water. Suddenly, a huge wave came toward them like a wall of destruction. Its force was so strong that it threw all four men away from the boat in different directions. The world spun around them. Water crashed from every side. They struggled in the darkness, trying to find one another and the overturned boat that was now their only shelter. Will suddenly shouted that he could see the boat. Nick swam toward it with all his strength. After what felt like hours, the four men somehow reached the boat and gathered together again. Will then cried out in pain. His leg had been cut by something and was bleeding. At that moment another large wave crashed over them. Meanwhile, Coast Guard officer Cruz still had not received an official report, but a vehicle with an empty boat trailer had been found at the harbor. It was the only vehicle left in the parking area. There had been no emergency signal and no SOS beacon. Cruz understood that the storm had been moving inland since the afternoon. In such cold water, a person's survival time after falling overboard was very limited. He immediately issued an alert, ordered all frequencies monitored, and told Cruz to listen on Channel 16. Search and rescue operations began. But there was very little they could do during the stormy night, and every minute of delay could mean the difference between life and death. At sea, conditions continued to deteriorate. Huge waves repeatedly knocked the men away from the boat, forcing them to swim back. Each impact drained more of their strength, and climbing onto the boat became harder each time. Suddenly someone shouted that something very large was underneath them. Marcus's response became weak. He spoke in a trembling voice and said he felt something happening inside him, as though his body was losing control and his strength was fading. Nick refused to let him give up. He told him not to talk as if he had already lost. Marcus continued weakly, saying that if he had to die there, perhaps it was his fate. He had said that morning that the ocean gave him peace and felt like home. His voice weakened further. Then his eyes seemed to brighten as he looked somewhere in the distance and murmured that he could see his daughter smiling and coming toward him. Nick immediately realized something was wrong. He shouted that his daughter was not there and shook Marcus to keep him conscious. Nick explained that Marcus was suffering from hypothermia. His body temperature had fallen to a dangerous level, affecting his brain and causing hallucinations. Marcus needed warmth. The four men pressed close together, placing Marcus in the middle and trying to share their body heat. But their own warmth was rapidly disappearing too. The night was long and the storm continued. Marcus was in the greatest danger, but all of them knew that if conditions did not change, none of them would last much longer. On land, Paula left another message for Nick, saying she was extremely worried. She said Marcus's truck was the only vehicle left in the parking lot. She tried to convince herself that perhaps the four friends had gone somewhere for drinks and simply turned their phones off. Nick's mother was also anxiously waiting. Marcus's wife, Rebecca, called too. Neither woman had any news. Rebecca said Marcus had told her he might return late, but the fact that his phone was off seemed strange. She tried to sound strong and said that the four men were strong and that nothing would happen to them. After the calls, the women comforted one another while their fear continued to grow. At sea, we'll try to keep Marcus conscious. Marcus improved for a short time, but then began speaking incoherently. Suddenly he became uncontrollably agitated and struggled violently. The others had to hold him down. He shouted for them to let him go. His eyes were empty, and it was clear that he could no longer distinguish reality from hallucination. At the Coast Guard office, Rebecca's call finally provided the missing information. She reported that Marcus and his three friends had gone to sea that morning and had been missing ever since. Crews learned that Marcus and Corey had previously been professional football players. Four strong men were trapped roughly 110 kilometers offshore in a terrible storm. The sun had set and there was still no signal. Crews explained that hypothermia was one of the most dangerous threats in such conditions. As body temperature falls below about 35 degrees Celsius, nerves and muscles begin to malfunction and the brain is affected, causing confusion and abnormal behavior. He classified the situation as a distress emergency. Fixed-wing aircraft and Black Hawk helicopters were launched. Rebecca was asked for GPS records so the fishing location could be identified. Rescue aircraft headed into the dark and dangerous sea. Rain began again over the ocean. Nick suddenly saw an opportunity and shouted to Marcus to open his mouth and drink the rainwater. At the same time, he noticed Corey's heart beating extremely fast. That too could happen during severe hypothermia as the body struggled to maintain circulation. Nick said his own heart was beating rapidly as well. Someone anxiously asked whether that meant they were going to die. Nick answered firmly that nobody was going to die. Above them, rescue aircraft were searching. The pilot reported that almost nothing could be seen. Visibility was nearly zero because of storm waves and heavy rain. Searching in those conditions was like trying to find a black needle in the dark. The men at sea had no idea that aircraft were circling above them. They only felt darkness, cold, and fear. Marcus was almost unconscious. Corey's mental state was deteriorating. Will's wound had been exposed to salt water for a long time and may have become infected. Nick was the only one still trying to keep himself under control, but he too could feel his strength fading. He remembered his father's voice, "We never give up." He told himself he had to keep going and keep the others alive because once he closed his eyes, they might never open again. On land, Paula went to Rebecca's house. Rebecca urged the Coast Guard to speed up the search and find the GPS containing Marcus's saved fishing points. She was panicking and could not find it. Paula calmed her and reminded her that she had said they needed to stay strong. Soon they found the GPS, turned it on, and recovered the saved coordinates. The location was immediately sent to the Coast Guard, marked on the map, and passed to the rescue aircraft. Conditions at sea became even worse. Marcus and Corey were both in bad shape. Corey said that he felt extremely hot. Will told him it was a hallucination and that his brain was deceiving him. Then another enormous wave struck and swept Marcus away. His life jacket slipped off and he disappeared into the sea. Nick screamed his name in disbelief and pain. Will searched for him, but there was no sign. Corey became completely confused and began screaming. Of the 4 men, only 3 remained, and one of them was barely conscious. Losing Marcus was not only the loss of a friend, it was the loss of hope. Then they heard an aircraft. Nick and Will gathered all their remaining strength and shouted. Nick switched on his phone flashlight and waved it wildly. An observer aboard the aircraft thought they might have seen a faint light. Everyone held their breath. The crew checked with binoculars and night vision, but concluded that the light was only lightning reflected on the water. The weather worsened, forcing the aircraft to climb and return. Below, Nick and Will continued shouting as the sound of the aircraft faded away. Hope had appeared and then disappeared again. Crews had to call Rebecca and tell her that the search was being suspended because of the weather. They would try again after the storm. Morning began to arrive. Only Nick and Will could be seen. Corey had also disappeared. Nick kept calling his name until his throat was hoarse, but there was no answer. Will finally said what they both already knew: Marcus and Corey were gone. Just the day before, there had been 4 friends laughing together. Now only 2 remained in the endless ocean. Will said that Marcus and Corey had been stronger than them, yet the ocean had defeated them. He asked how much longer they could survive. Nick said that having less body fat had worked against them. Their wet clothes still provided a little warmth. He told Will to find something else to wear, but Will refused because he did not want to enter the water again. Then Nick saw a shadow beneath the water. A shark. They quickly climbed onto the boat. Will's wound was still bleeding. Nick reassured him that sharks usually followed fish and that they were unlikely to attack them. But the fear continued to grow. Will asked whether Nick went to church. When death seems close, people begin thinking about God, the soul, and what comes after death. Nick said he could not remember, it had been a long time. Will asked whether Nick had become an atheist. Nick angrily said that he was simply living in reality. What could he ask from a God who had allowed his friends to die? Will told him not to be angry and not to abandon God. Nick said he had not abandoned anything. Their conversation reflected 2 different ways of facing death. Will was searching for comfort in faith, while Nick was fighting through anger and determination. Whatever their approach, the ocean remained in front of them, cold and merciless. At the base, Captain Cruz ordered the families to be informed immediately so they would not hear the worst news through a sudden television report. An officer asked whether the operation should be changed from search and rescue to search and recovery. Cruz firmly refused. He said it was too early and that there was still hope. Daylight would give them an advantage, and he ordered a large rescue vessel to be sent out. The ship's siren sounded and the crew gathered. They were told to search near St. Petersburg for a small boat carrying 4 missing people that might have overturned. Cruz warned that electronic equipment could be unreliable in such weather, so they should keep their eyes on the water. The human eye, he said, could still be their best tool. The sun rose higher, but the cold did not disappear. Nick felt that his fingers had become stiff and numb. His lips were trembling and every breath was becoming difficult. Will was also in bad condition. They understood that without help soon, they could not last much longer. Still, they kept looking at each other, as if simply staying together was keeping them alive. On land, Nick's mother, Marcia, learned that the Coast Guard had stopped the search and rescue mission. She became furious. At sea, Nick's fingers were numb from the cold and he cried out in pain. Another huge wave struck and pushed both men underwater. They fought their way back to the surface. Will said it was a terrible idea, but Nick replied that they could drown anyway. At least if they stayed tied to the boat, there was still a chance. After some hesitation, Will tied himself to the boat too. Now, no matter how strong the waves became, they would not be separated. But if the boat sank, they would go down with it. At the Coast Guard base, Marcia questioned an officer about why the news was calling the mission a recovery operation. The officer explained that more than 200 people were involved in the search and that a patrol vessel had also been deployed, but pilots could not be placed in extreme danger during the storm. The storm was expected to end in about an hour, after which the search would resume. Marcia asked whether he truly believed Nick was alive. The officer told her to keep believing and promised that they would do everything possible. At sea, the two men repeatedly fell into the waves and climbed back onto the boat. They were completely exhausted but still alive. Suddenly they heard an airplane. They waved with their remaining strength. Will said that daylight had arrived and surely the aircraft would see them. But the plane flew on without responding. It slowly disappeared into the sky. Their bright life jackets were now clearly visible in daylight, yet nobody saw them. After some silence, Nick said they had been in the water for about 24 hours. Will asked how long the Coast Guard would keep searching. Nick said he did not know. Will suggested that if they needed to search the boat for food, they should do it while there was still daylight. Nick agreed. He considered removing his clothes, but Will said he would go instead. He took a deep breath and entered the water. Inside the dark cabin, Will felt around until he found a plastic bag. He surfaced with it. Inside were mustard-flavored packets of food gel. Will gave a weak smile and said he did not like the flavor, but they were hungry. They quickly ate. Suddenly Will pointed into the distance and asked whether that was land. Nick looked and saw something that appeared like the shadow of land. Both men could see it. Nick took out the phone, but his fingers were numb. Will operated it and the screen showed no signal. Nick wondered whether it could be a hallucination. Will asked how two people could see the same hallucination. No aircraft had appeared for hours. Will said they had to swim toward it now or they might never get another chance. They untied themselves and began swimming in that direction. But after a short time, Will realized something was wrong. He shouted that it was not land, it was an illusion. Their weakness was playing tricks on their minds. Worse, when he turned around, the boat was no longer visible. They had swum far away from it while chasing the illusion. They shouted each other's names and searched blindly through the water for the overturned boat. Eventually Nick found it and clung to it. He kept calling for Will. After a while, Will also reached the boat. They were together again. At the Coast Guard base, Captain Cruz continued coordinating the search. No target had been found. A report said that the search had covered 66 nautical miles and would continue until dark. Nothing could be seen on the ocean surface. The men had now been drifting at sea for about 30 hours. Nick noticed that Will had become unusually quiet. He asked whether he was okay. Will said he was just thinking. He wondered why the boat had not completely sunk. He also wondered what people would say at his funeral and whether his body would ever be found. His mind was no longer functioning normally. He muttered that he should have married the girl he loved and bought her a 1.5-carat diamond ring. If he had married her, he imagined, she would have refused to let him take this trip, and he would now be home planning children with her. Will weakly asked Nick whether he could tell his parents something. He could not form complete sentences and kept repeating, "Tell my mother." Nick refused. He said he would not tell his parents anything because Will would tell them himself. But Will kept repeating the request. Then Will suddenly said that he felt very hot. He said he was no longer cold. Nick understood that this could be a sign of severe hypothermia. When a person begins feeling warm instead of cold, the brain may no longer be accurately interpreting the body's temperature. Will began trying to remove his clothes. Nick desperately stopped him and shouted at him not to do it. Another enormous wave struck and swept Will into the water. Nick grabbed the rope and pulled him back with all his strength. But Will was already unconscious. Another powerful wave came. This time Will's body disappeared into the waves and was lost in the dark ocean. Nick shouted his name again and again, but only the sound of the sea answered. Will was gone. Marcus was gone. Corey was gone. There had once been 4 close friends. Now Nick was alone, floating in the dark ocean. He shouted toward the sky in anger, releasing all the pain, rage, and helplessness inside him. He asked why he was the one who survived and why the other 3 had been taken. His father's voice echoed in his mind, "Never be among the ones who give up." Nick no longer understood what he was fighting for. All his friends were dead. He was alone in the ocean, and rescue might never come. But he was still alive. He was still breathing. As long as he could breathe, he had to keep fighting. He saw it as a debt to his 3 friends. He had to survive so that he could tell their story and let their families know how bravely they had fought until the end. Nick held tightly to the boat. Darkness deepened, but he continued his fight for life alone. At the base, an officer addressed everyone and said he understood what they were feeling, but they could not leave yet. Hope was their greatest strength and the last thing they had left. He urged everyone to trust in God and pray that the boys would be found and brought safely home. Later, an order came to end the search operation and return all units. Many sailors were discouraged, but some suggested searching for a few more minutes. They did not want to give up. They wanted to make one final attempt. Paula called Nick again. The call went to voicemail. She left a message saying it was very late and everyone was extremely worried. She joked that perhaps he was creating suspense, but within seconds her voice broke. She said she hoped everyone was okay and perhaps they were simply outside the signal area. But deep inside she feared that she might never see him again. Her voice broke as she cried and ended the call. Marcia came to her and hugged her. Marcia said she believed Nick was alive and could somehow feel that he was still out there. She suggested that the 2 women talk to him from their hearts so that wherever he was, he would know he was not alone. They held each other, cried, and prayed toward the open sea. At sea, Nick was completely exhausted. Sometimes he was conscious and sometimes barely aware. The sound of the ocean seemed to echo around him. He shouted into the empty sea, but his voice disappeared. After many hours adrift, Nick began hallucinating. He heard his friends laughing and saw memories of the time they had spent together. Everything felt so real that he thought he could reach out and touch them, but whenever he tried, the images vanished. Then Nick made a decision. He began loosening the rope that had tied him to the boat, the same rope that had helped keep him alive during the storm. His fingers were frozen and heavy, but slowly he untied the knot. The rope loosened. He was free. Nick lay on his back on the boat. The white underside of the overturned vessel was beneath him and the blue sky was above. He closed his eyes. He was no longer fighting, shouting, or waiting for help that might never come. His 3 friends were gone, and he began thinking that perhaps he should go to them too. He believed his parents would understand and know that he had tried his best. He truly had tried his best. His breathing became slow and calm. His body relaxed. Sunlight warmed his face and the waves gently rocked the boat. Everything felt strangely peaceful, as if there were no more pain, cold, or loneliness. He thought that perhaps he could simply sleep and let everything end. He imagined meeting Marcus, Corey, and Will in a dream, all of them together again and never separated. But at that exact moment, a rescue boat passed nearby and spotted him. It happened just as Nick had closed his eyes and finally stopped fighting. An incredible moment had arrived. A report immediately reached the base that a target had been found. Captain Cruz ordered all helicopters to go to the location. They had been waiting for this moment for 2 days. The rescue helicopter arrived. An observer reported seeing an adult male. The helicopter hovered above Nick. He raised his head and saw it, but he was so weak that he could not tell whether it was real or another hallucination. At the base, everyone held their breath. Captain Cruz asked whether the man was alive. Seconds later the answer came, the target was alive. But Cruz did not celebrate. He immediately asked where the other 3 were. He ordered the search to continue because they still needed to find the other men. Nick was pulled aboard. When asked his name, he answered in a heavy, broken voice, "My name is Nick." His name traveled over the radio to the base. Marcia's phone rang. She answered and cried out. She and Paula hugged each other and wept. In another home, a phone also rang, but no one answered because the family already understood that their loved one was not coming back. The helicopter flew Nick to safety. Below, the white overturned boat continued floating in the ocean. It was the same boat that had witnessed the 4 friends' laughter, fear, courage, and final moments. Now it floated alone, a witness to the tragedy. The search continued for several days, but Marcus, Corey, and Will were never found. The ocean had taken them. Nick was the only survivor, the only person who could tell the story of what happened. He survived, but in another sense, a part of him remained forever in that ocean. His friends' smiles, courage, and final struggle became part of his life. He was alive so he could remember them and so the world could know how bravely they had fought until their final moments. This was not simply a survival story. It was a story of humanity, friendship, love, and courage. It was also a story about the lesson his father had taught him, never give up. That lesson became his light between life and death. The script concludes by saying that 4 friends went into the ocean on February 28, 2003, and only one returned. The 3 who never came back would nevertheless be remembered through Nick's story, their friendship, their courage, and the way they fought to survive.